Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is on enterprise identity management. My name is Zach Cole, CEO of Whiteblock, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Whiteblock is a testing and development platform for blockchain and distributed systems. Our tools help developers and business organizations understand the how and why of implementing decentralized technologies like blockchain as business solutions. Blockchain as a decentralized identity solution can present unique value for today's organizations that are attempting to reduce risk, improve operational processes, and increase the reliability of traditional identity management technologies. Traditional identity management solutions have been historically complex, and when improperly managed or implemented can result in significant vulnerability and cost. Today, we're going to be discussing the concept of decentralized identity within the context of business. To share their insight into the value of blockchain for identity management, we're joined by a panel of subject matter experts. We have Carol Fowler, CEO of Transmute, Cappy Adwar, CRO of Samsung SDS, Craig Winter, Senior Director at Syniverse, and Jacob Blish, Operations Lead at ConsenSys. Each of our panelists will share their take on decentralized identity management, followed by a Q&A-led discussion on the topic. Feel free to drop any questions as we go along, and we will start the conversation with Carol. Welcome, Carol. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about Transmute and the solutions you provide?
Hi, everyone. My name is Carol Fowler. I'm CEO and co-founder at Transmute, a software startup based in Austin, Texas, that's been focused for the last 3 years on decentralized identity for the enterprise. Since this is an overview, I thought I'd start at the top. Awesome. So at Transmute, we consider identity to be the gene of all software applications. And what I mean by this is that no application can be built without addressing or solving for identity management. Next slide. And unfortunately, the centralized systems and infrastructure that we use to support identity and access management today are now starting to fail us. Next slide. Not only has this led to rampant data breaches that has cost us billions, and we're seeing these in the headlines daily, but it's also led to nearly every country on the planet considering revision of or creation of new data privacy regulations that more stringently protect both consumers and brands. Next slide. And the result is what we at Transmute call the enterprise identity crisis, which is a situation that describes today's an environment today where companies have to, as companies grow, they also have to grow their risk disproportionately. And when I say grow their risk disproportionately, I mean they have to take on liability and responsibility for a significant amount of data, personal identifying data and otherwise that isn't necessarily relevant to the transaction at hand or the service or product that they're providing their business, or excuse me, their customers. And then the slide you're looking at now is how we at Transmute are solving the enterprise identity crisis for businesses with our first product. So you're looking at Transmute ID, which leverages distributed ledger technologies in tandem with existing legacy and cloud infrastructure to ensure that businesses can take on less risk as they grow, operate more efficiently, and more easily comply with emerging privacy regulations and standards. Next slide. The 3 technologies we use to power this are existing cloud storage technologies. This helps us continue to address the scale that our customers are already serving. We use distributed public key cryptography to power the decentralized identity components. And then we use the blockchain as an automatic tracking or compliance layer, so an audit log. Next slide. And what you're looking at here is our workflow engine. While the underlying technology that we just described is the very same in every one of our deployments, all of our customers use different workflows and different internal processes to accomplish their goal. So our product includes a workflow engine overlay. You can think of the Transmute workflow engine as a guided experience that walks our customers through digitizing their existing, largely manual processes and onboarding ecosystem identities like their vendors or their employees. Next slide. Since this is a high-level introduction to the use of decentralized identities for enterprises, I wanted to include the framework that we use internally to help customers assess whether or not this technology solves pain within their business. If the answer to all 3 of these questions is yes, we believe it's worth exploring further. And there's a lot more information you can find on the development of this framework through Harvard Business Review. Next slide. So our first market is actually supply chain logistics, because this is an area where the answer to all three of those questions is yes. Supply chain logistics companies are incredibly concerned about selective disclosure. In order to build efficient processes, they have to share some data, but they also are very concerned with protecting proprietary data like their routes or the kinds of trust relationships they have with various vendors. They also have an extremely high burden of coordination with countless vendors across a variety of mediums to manage. And then finally, there are a lot of traceability and liability standards that they need to comply with to know who was liable for what when a shipment was in process. So now we're going to talk about the enterprise identity crisis in the context of a specific case study in supply chain logistics. So today, a lot of our customers are still using largely fragmented, super manual processes for managing their supply chains, which means that their systems are still fragmented and opaque, and they're lacking a complete view of the chains of custody that they're managing, which has led to significant revenue loss and increased risk for their customers. Next slide. And so what Transmute ID, again, does is extend the security or extend the existing security properties of centralized identity access management systems and combines it with the security advantages of decentralized identities and specifically verifiable credentials to power verifiable or cryptographically secure workflows between businesses in an ecosystem. Awesome, you can skip to the next. So this is an example use case. We have worked on a variety of very similar use cases to this with our customers. And the question that we're going to be talking about here is, how do we know where a raw material like steel, for instance, which is used to secure critical American infrastructure, where has this steel been sourced from? And how do we know if it has been tariffed correctly upon import into the United States? Next slide. So for example, when steel slab is produced somewhere like Anshan, China, using Transmute ID, the company would register with Transmute ID. So that means first, we would integrate with their existing identity and access management system. We'd inextricably link all of the identities within their existing system to a decentralized identifier. And what happens from there is then this company can tag each unit that is shipped with a verifiable credential that links to the decentralized identifiers linked to their corporate brand and the steel's, the individual steel identifiers as well. These company-linked decentralized identities can create credentials on behalf of the importer. This is right. Oh, you can actually go back to transport. So when the units actually, as the units are handed off between each point of the chain of custody, each shipping company or logistics firm that takes custody of the steel uses their company decentralized identities to extend the very first credential with their additional shipping information. So today, the way it works is there's a lot of manual paper, and each piece of paper, it has subsequent signatures and is added to the larger shipping package or the e-bill of lading. In our system, this is done by using decentralized identity key signatures to extend that credential. Next slide. So when the shipment finally reaches something like the Port of Los Angeles, the government import agencies then can scan the linked verifiable credential and issue a new one indicating that the port of entry has approved the import. Next slide. And a complete picture of the supply chain for the steel import is now available thanks to the linked data credentials created by Transmute ID and signed by the company decentralized identities linked to the relevant brands. And that looks like this last slide. So a big part of the value that we're providing here is not only to digitize existing paper credentials that are handed off at various points of custody, but also to create a cryptographically secure top-level view of each of those handoff points in the chain of custody. And you can go to the next slide. For any engineers on the line, I wanted to show a little bit about our architecture and how we're able to achieve this. And many people wonder, okay, well, what distributed ledger protocol are you using? What centralized infrastructure do you support? And the fact of the matter is, especially in a space like supply chain logistics, everyone is using disparate and very different systems. And so we've built the Transmute ID architecture to be highly flexible and highly agnostic to what these systems are. On the centralized side, we support the top 3 major public cloud providers for storage plus Oracle Cloud. And on the IDP side, we integrate with anything that is OpenID Connect or Active Directory based. This has supported most companies today. On the distributed ledger side, we can anchor hash links to anything that's Ethereum or EVM based and anything that's Hyperledger Fabric based today. The next slide. Something we'll probably touch on a bit in Q&A is standards. So when you're working with legacy infrastructure, you have to be cognizant of the existing standards and regulations that brands have to comply with today. And we certainly are. But many of you may be aware that the W3C and the Decentralized Identity Foundation are driving new standards and interoperability implementations specific to decentralized identities and verifiable credentials. And our team at Transmute co-leads the scalability initiatives and chairs the interoperability initiatives under the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which helps make sure that all of the verifiable credentials that we issue as companies are interoperable, and we don't create a more siloed situation. And then I think the last slide is just a peek at the team. This is my team. I'm very proud of them. And with that, thank you guys so much for your time. I'll mute till Q&A.
Joining us next is Cappy Adwar from Samsung, who will be discussing next ledger identity applications. Thank you for joining us, Cappy. Why don't you take over?
Zach, if you don't mind pushing the slides for me, I'd appreciate that. Thanks for the opportunity to present at this thing. So I think Carol did a great job of actually laying the foundation for what we want to talk about. I'm going to look at a slightly different example. The example there was logistics, where we are also seeing a lot of action, but wanted to talk about a specific case in the financial services industry to use it as an example. So without further ado, let's go into the presentation. This is just some marketing stuff, just to say we've been around for about 4 years. We've got quite a lot of customers and a lot of patents out in the market, and we're starting to get recognition. Samsung is relatively unknown in the marketplace, but we are now pushing out from Asia, where we've had our early successes. And the example I'm going to talk about today, excuse me, is one of our customers that is live and working. So we want to really bring the experiences that we've had over the last 4 years into the US and North America market. Next slide, please. Now, we started our journey by basically building our own platform, which is really taking open source material from both the Hyperledger and Ethereum ecosystems and creating our own ledger called with a consensus algorithm called NCA, and you can see it circled at the bottom there. As we started to go outside of Asia, we began to realize that there was also already a significant presence for the likes of Hyperledger Fabric and Ethereum and a couple of other ones out there. The other ones are very potentially industry vertical, and we are very much in the horizontal space. In the last 4 years, we've built a lot of IP in terms of modules, things like digital identity, payment, stamping, etc. So we kind of changed our strategy midway through the year, and we now offer 3 options, which is either you can build entirely on the Samsung platform, or you can build using our pre-built modules, which you see at the top here, digital identity, etc. And actually point it at something like Hyperledger or Ethereum. So that way you can leverage the investment that you've already made in your research of blockchain, I guess, over the last few years, because there aren't that many production systems out there. And take advantage of our pre-built modules, so you don't have to start from scratch. Next slide, please, Zach. So we've been building a lot of IP in the following areas. I talked about pre-built modules, and today we're really just going to focus on the one on the far left, which is digital identity. But if people have questions about any of the other areas, Carol talked about logistics, where IoT is a big player. So when we talk about digital identity, we're not just talking about people, we're also talking about things, part of the industrial IoT and the regular IoT infrastructure. Next slide, please, Zach. Another thing that's become very important in the ecosystem that I should mention is that really there are two blockchain initiatives inside of Samsung. One is the enterprise one, which is the one I'm going to really focus on today, which is part of our group. So I'm responsible for blockchain in North America for Samsung SDS. But there's another initiative that's coming out of the Samsung Electronics stable, and it's really focused on how can you secure the end device. And of course, you may have heard that the Samsung S10 and the Note 10 were both released with a hard wallet and a key store. And that basically gives you an extra level of security so that now you can not only store crypto, but you can also store credentials and other things. You can store things like loyalty points or warranty information. You can store all kinds of things on a device. You can map that onto the person. And actually, just before this call, I was talking to a bank that is really interested in this model that we have that I'm going to talk about today, which is really providing identity for both consumers and companies so that they can transact across boundaries in many, many different ways. And really, it's about putting users in control of their data and credentials by holding them on their device. So right now, you've got these two ends of the spectrum from a Samsung perspective. The back end, where we are building a platform for identity management that can be reused in multiple industries. Today, I'm going to talk about financial services. But at the front end, we've also got the device that can give you military-grade security for protecting your credentials, your cryptocurrency, whatever it is you want to protect at the front end. Next slide, please, Zach. So these are some of our marquee customers, and today I'm going to talk about the Korea Federation of Banks because that's the topic that's most relevant to what we're going to talk about today. You'll see there logistics and manufacturing are two of the things, and actually that's very closely connected to what Carol was talking about earlier. Next slide, please. So the Korea Federation of Banks was really interested in creating an ecosystem whereby once you've got a KYC, AML, and identity with one bank in the country of Korea, then basically you could use it anywhere in the country. You don't have to have multiple systems, different standards, different definitions, any of that. So they've now built a system that's in operation. It's got roughly about 100,000 users every day that are using the system. And basically it means that you can transact with any bank in the country if you have an identity that's established with one bank. It also basically creates a lot of convenience for the banks as well as the consumers, because now the banks don't have to worry about identity management and AML and KYC because it's all in one contained system. They can focus on actually building new services. And that's really what we are building with them. Now, I did have a video to talk about some of the uses of this, but I don't think it's the right setup for us to do that today. But really now, once you have that identity, you can enable people to do transactions in terms of maybe credit card loyalty points. You can do things like using points to pay for things like coffee. You can pay your health insurance. You can do all kinds of things with this one thing, with this one back-end infrastructure around identity that you've created. Now, of course, much as we'd like everybody to build on Samsung and to have Samsung devices, the world doesn't actually work like that. So there's a lot of interoperability built into this, so that once you have that identity, you can interoperate with other blockchains and other backend systems that are currently in existence. So that's a really important aspect of this. Next slide, please, Zach. This is just a visual to show you the banks that are part of this ecosystem. And also on the left-hand side, you'll see like the equivalent of a mobile device, which really stores the credentials of the person that has got the identity so that they can transact in any environment. Next slide, please, Zach. So what's next? I mean, we are really building a standardized platform on which enterprises can build applications and accelerators with identity, access, and reputation. Basically, that's what we're doing. And this, I actually break this into two segments, and maybe there's three. The first one is, what can you do as an enterprise? Can you leverage all the technology that's already been built, create a unified identity system, either for yourself or for a consortium, as in this case? But then how do you scale it? And in that regard, we are starting to build partnerships, and you're going to hear from Craig from Syniverse next, where we really, people got very, very excited and in some cases agitated about the fact that, Facebook had, launched Libra, and there were 3 billion people they could potentially access. If you think about the telecom ecosystem, which is the background. Sorry, Craig, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, but basically we can access a lot more customers than that. So we're effectively creating a different extension to what we have right now, so that people can dramatically scale what they're doing. We're getting gaming companies coming to us and talking about, today I have a currency or a token system for my game, and people can buy and sell things inside my game. What do I need to do to actually extend beyond the game? And so we are looking at, and the bank I was talking to earlier today, they want to do exactly that. They want to create an identity system that gives them access to a huge population beyond the people who have the regular identity, KYC, and AML systems that we are familiar with. And so this is not just about creating a stable backend where you can transact and build services, but about extension beyond that. And that's what Craig's going to talk about. So I think I should probably hand over to Craig at that point. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cappy. That's really interesting. So again, I want to note that we're going to have a Q&A following up. So thanks again to the attendees that are joining us. Be sure to stick around for that Q&A. And now we'll have Craig take lead on the conversation. So welcome, Craig. Why don't you tell us a bit about Syniverse?
Great. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Cappy, for teeing that up so well. I'm Craig Winter. I'm Senior Director Product for Intelligent Engagement and Identity Services at Syniverse. And a little bit, what I'm going to be talking about is, to build on what Carol and Cappy have said, an important aspect of blockchain and decentralized identity is trust. So how do you use blockchain and decentralized identity to enhance trust in mobile devices? Quick background on Syniverse. We're a mobile technologies company. You may not have heard of us, but I guarantee you carriers and telcos around the world have. We've been around for 30 years. We operate the largest private network that interconnects hundreds of carriers all over the world. And that is what Cappy was alluding to. We can connect to 7 billion mobile devices around the world. And we run messaging on top of that network to the degree of billions of messages per day. We also handle the payment system for clearing and settlement. So every phone call is a transaction. You can imagine how many phone calls are happening as we speak around the world. So when you're roaming or you've received a one-time passcode on your device or even a text message, odds are very likely that Syniverse enabled that communication. So we handle this communication at massive scale, lots of connectivity, and we also make sure that all the stakeholders get paid. So that was kind of the genesis of our foray into blockchain, this clearing and settlement aspect of it. We asked ourselves, This is, we can handle this at scale, billions of transactions. What other kinds of transactions could we use this clearing and settlement engine technology and infrastructure for? And it made sense to adapt that to the blockchain to be able to handle any kind of transaction, whether it's a monetary transaction, trust in doing API lookups, any kind of transaction that multiple parties want to get paid for. So in terms of the devices, and again, when we talk about devices, that's mobile phones predominantly in our context, but that also applies to IoT devices. So some of the attributes that we use to establish trust in a device are traditional things like certificates and keys, but also newer things like baking in certain identifiers into SIM cards that would go into a sensor or a phone. And then there's some dynamic things too that we need to track too that change. And by dynamic, I mean, think of your subscriber record at a Verizon or AT&T. There are multiple attributes there tied to your phone number. And if any of those attributes change, like your device ID, your SIM card, that's a very common case for account takeover. Somebody does what they call SIM swap and tries to get your phone number assigned to a phone they just bought, and then they get access, of course, to whatever your phone number was associated with. So these are the things that we can use to establish and maintain and monitor for trust. And the last one here is derive. Just a category I call derived because it can be derived dynamically from device fingerprints. All the parameters, all the environment that is associated with your device can be used to uniquely identify your device. And a couple of other things is, so we're establishing trust in devices. We also want to establish trust with humans, of course, typical decentralized identity associated with you as a person, and of course, maintain the association between you and a device, particularly your phone. And then be able to handle things like if you lose your phone, right? You have a wallet on your phone, you want to be able to revoke and restore access to your wallet and your identity, of course. And with respect to the goal for mobile phones is what we hear from enterprises is their top priority really is, of course, to establish identity control fraud, but also to create that frictionless experience for every interaction with their customers. So the whole idea of you log in during your session, whether it's an airline or a retailer, you can take actions in the background. We can look up, do multiple trust lookups to maintain trust, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. But for you as a customer, completely transparent, frictionless, and you just go on your way, booking a flight or buying a product or transferring funds. And with respect to IoT, we want to protect the network and all the connected devices from spoofing and fraud and takeover as well. You can imagine how important that is for connected car and medical devices. So one thing I'll touch upon really quickly, I know Carol teed this up very well, is why blockchain? I'm sure a lot of you on the call have had this conversation, even if you're a blockchain expert already, is why are we using blockchain instead of a shared or a traditional centralized database? It's because you get this transparency, and the best way I've heard anybody put it is everybody on the chain, everybody with access to it, shares the same reality, which is very interesting. I wish I came up with that. I wish that applied to the real world. So if everybody at the same time is sharing the same reality, that gives you a very high degree of trust and communications and notifications, which I'll get to in just a second here too. But using the blockchain and decentralized identity as well to allow people to release and control certain proof points about themselves without risking PII. And here, this establishing trust without risking PII is probably the most important element for me, is that you want to prove that there's been no account takeover on your phone, but somebody trying to verify that, a brand or an organization, does not have to see your entire record. They just need to know something about you that is true in order to establish trust, to allow you to do a transaction. So that's a very important component related to trust and protecting privacy and data leakage as well. Can't leak data that you don't have. So there's also an aspect of high availability and reliability. So think about, the privacy protection, everybody's sharing the same reality, getting notified that an event that you can trust has happened on your network and that you can take actions based on that event. So you're getting that transparency, that immutability, that trust through the blockchain. So where does the source of this data? So think about us and what Syniverse, what we're trying to do with identity services. We're trying to be an exchange of identity, trying to go out there and essentially do what we did for messaging. We route messages. When you try and send a message to somebody, we figure out where it's supposed to go, who the carrier is. We want to do the same kinds of things for identity. So if you're using a decentralized identifier, or as they call it, a DID, we want to be able to look up your DID document and find out how we find that decentralized zero-knowledge proof to enable trust in your session there too. So that data can come from a variety of sources, manufacturers if it's hardware, systems integrators, brands, governments if it's a government ID, your telco if it's related to your phone or your device or your subscriber record, or from more traditional risk data aggregators, formerly known as credit bureaus, but people who have information about you. If we're trying to verify you are who you say you are, we want to be able to go out there while protecting your privacy and establish that trust in the phone that you're holding on your hand. One more, I'll dig a little bit deeper into how we've implemented blockchain here. This particular use case for universal commerce, which is clearing and settlement, but our name for it is universal commerce, is to be able to initiate any kind of a transaction, particularly smart contracts as well. So a deal gets initiated, then it has to be settled, and everybody needs to get paid. So back to this is, every business, every entity involved in this blockchain network shares the same reality through distributed ledger. And of course, that makes everything much more efficient, transparent, and disintermediates some central authority that you would formerly have to have depended on in order to execute your transaction and get everybody paid. So all these things tie together on our network. So one other thing I alluded to just a second ago is kind of a unique aspect of blockchain transactions here too. We want to be able to use those as triggers for messaging. So for example, back, the supply chain, imagine if a package or a cold chain in that supply chain, medical supplies, food, maybe the sensor tells you that there's been a temperature spike, and that shipment, that container now cannot be used. There's a lot of people that need to get notified by that. So we'd want to use that consensus-driven event. You can trust that the event happened. Everybody shares the same reality. Now the right people have to be notified about that event. And that messaging comes in where we would trigger on whatever channel the users have, whether it's push notifications or text messages, we'd notify the right parties that they need to take action on this equipment or this shipment. It needs to be fixed, moved, or dealt with. And I'll kind of finish with some of the trends that we're seeing here. One of the things that's been very exciting, especially recently, is the size of the community, the Decentralized Identity Foundation and the Hyperledger organization. Everything that's happening in this ecosystem is happening faster now. It's getting more standardized. The W3C, if you have time to look at the standards that are being set, they're being set at a very rapid pace right now. So this is not something that's going to take years to develop. And as Kapi mentioned, the banks are getting on board with this. There's tremendous interest in this. And when I say like microservices, what things are happening in the blockchain world now that happened with microservices. The things that AWS and the public clouds allowed you to do as a developer, as an organization, to do things a lot faster, focus on your application instead of the underlying complexity of the infrastructure, and be able to do things much faster, bring things to market much faster, and iterate much faster. So that's one of the benefits of things like Samsung is doing, like Next Ledger, right? Some of the things you may have heard about blockchain is like, that's great about the trust and transparency and immutability, but it doesn't scale. Well, that's not really true anymore, right? So we're getting past that. This is becoming a reality. We're addressing all the scale issues, and it's also getting easier to deploy and adopt in the real world. And some of those use cases, as you can imagine, for decentralization is gig labor, contract labor, where there's temporal employees that need to get temporary access to things. You want to verify they did what they were supposed to do. But we talked about supply chain and logistics, payments as well, and then connected devices and think again about the frictionless customer experience. So all of these use cases and all of these verticals are being made more efficient, more secure, more trust. With trust, you get efficiency, and you remove friction through trust. And you also, of course, reduce fraud through trust. So I will leave you with this thought that this is happening. It's happening faster. It's getting easier to deploy, and you don't have to be a cryptographic expert to be able to get involved with blockchain and to start hosting your applications and use cases on this newer infrastructure. And decentralized identity, again, to me is the most exciting part of that, is that you can get access to more data without risking PII. So you can enable even more use cases through the decentralized aspect of blockchain infrastructure. And that's what I have.
I'd like to remind the audience to start queuing up questions for their Q&A after the session. Up next, we have Jacob Blish, Operations Lead of ConsenSys. Why don't you take it away, Jacob?
So my name's Jacob Blish. I am actually part of a small team inside of ConsenSys called Alpine. Everyone, thankfully, has made my job a lot easier by setting up a lot of the background. So I'll keep this short and to the point so we can get to some questions. Our team, Alpine, actually focuses on research and development around what we lovingly call Web 2.5. Our thinking is primarily focused on how do we bridge from Web 2 today into the Web 3 of the future we all keep hearing about. And identity is actually a huge missing component of that we are trying to help solve. So ConsenSys, for those that don't know, is a large global blockchain development studio, about 1,000 employees all over the world, and about, I think it's 19 offices at this point. Our primary focus is fostering the core infrastructure of Ethereum and Ethereum Enterprise, but it is not exclusively Ethereum. And we even recently joined the Hyperledger Foundation as well to contribute our permissioned Ethereum solution to their open source work. And we're a member of the W3C and the DIF, which you've heard a bunch about today. I highly recommend everyone check those out because we're all working together to make sure we have a unified framework so that we can actually get this technology adopted. So one of the proof of concepts I was going to talk about explicitly today is around vendor and partner due diligence, as well as managing multiple parties across various workflows inside of an organization. So it can result in a lot of duplicative, time-consuming onboarding processes that is expensive and error-prone. And our goal was primarily to help these vendors leverage previously issued credentials with the same organization so that they can help bootstrap into new projects or compete on bidding of new projects more effectively and more quickly. And this would allow faster checking of certifications as well as ongoing background checks to quickly re-verify as needed. The core problem where we did work that I wanted to talk about is with the city of New York. The New York City Economic Development Corporation actually manages and owns about a 1.5 billion square feet of real estate across, I think, around 12,000 assets in the city. And for each of these property assets, they're interacting with dozens of different agencies, and the vendor onboarding and tracking of tenant changes is time-consuming, open to error. And to give you just a little bit of a scope with this problem, so if the city's looking to buy an asset, they have to work with a seller or a broker. They have to work with the mayor's office of contractual services to run a background check of any external parties where funds or work is being done, since they're funded publicly, to make sure there's no criminal activity or bad ongoing issues. They have to inspect the property with a third party, estimate costs to revitalize those needs, whether it's an incubator, lifestyle, workspace, commercial use. They have to get the city law involved to make sure the title is clean, the insurance is up to date, everything is normal from a real estate perspective. Then if it's a go, they have to bring together all these pieces for the executive board committee, enter the sale, sign contracts, and wire the funds. At this point, the city now owns the property. Then for the actual rehabilitation, they need to work with service contractors, maybe to put up a fence to prevent outsiders from accessing the property during the reconstruction. The city has to allocate the proper funds, working with various agencies there. They have to hire designers, brokers, find tenants, construction companies, and then at the end of the life cycle, the property can either be fed back into the top of the funnel to be revitalized for new economic use, or it could enter into a sales process interfacing with additional parties. That's all just for a single property, and it was a little bit long just to show you the scope. Every agency hosts their own information, works with their own third-party vendors, and if a single copy is changed, if a single document is changed, that copy is not syndicated properly across all of these workflows, and there's no guarantee of who was interfaced or who was accountable for working with those documents. So the technology that we developed for this, we've started productizing called GraphID, and GraphID is actually a verifiable credential and management verification engine. It is very much middleware, and our goal is never to rip and replace existing architecture. There has been billions of dollars spent by enterprises over decades to build their systems. We don't want to dump the baby out with the bathwater. So for example, if you use Azure Active Directory, GraphID can plug into that, and this is just as an example, could issue a one-to-one private key for a wallet address, for example, for all the employees inside of an enterprise so that they would be able to either interface with a private permissioned blockchain or even acting on behalf of the organization or company on the public blockchains, and you'd have an audit record of all of their transactions and what they're up to. And in the example here, the way we build a graph is if someone like Alice wanted to become a driver for a ride-sharing company, she might have to upload a lot of documents that get verified by a third party. Maybe it's in FIDO or Thomson Reuters Clear, doesn't matter. GraphID just handles the pass-through and then grabs those credentials when the verification is proven as good or bad. Maybe she has to upload some vehicle registration and insurance for liability issues, as well as some information about her car to make sure it hasn't been in a wreck or is stolen. And all of these attributes tie together to create a graph around Alice, which can be used by either herself in the self-sovereign future or by Lyft in this case to understand what Alice can or cannot do on their platform. And so what we came up with, let me skip okay, so it's missing the last slide, so give me 1 second and I'll talk through this. So what we actually did is our concept that we built for the city of New York is we built an overlay on their map that they already had, the DOITT, Department of Information Technology and something, I can't remember the acronym, already has an existing map where you can pull up various attributes about real estate in the city of New York. So what we wanted to do was take that concept a little bit further to be able to tag work permits, financial and construction documents to the property to make the orchestration itself much easier. So what this ends up doing is the building itself becomes a non-person entity with its own identity that manages the documents and workflows related to itself and the people who have access to the relevant documents on that property. So we wanted this to become this orchestration layer where any of the involved agencies could go to this map, quickly see which properties they're involved with, and have a overview of any documents or issues that have come up and see where progress is, regardless of if they're holding up on the process or if someone else is. And what this did and where the blockchain comes in is, first of all, we don't want to build document storage that's already been solved. So we plugged into the Box API because they have a clean room environment, they're highly secure, they're well done, and they already handle document collaboration. So what we did is we added the element of a blockchain here where at every step of the process, whether you're issuing new documents, whether you're inviting new signatories that need to sign documents in this particular workflow, whether you're uploading a document, revising a document, or leaving a comment on a document, all of those have to be written and transacted to a blockchain. That can be private, it can be public. It's most of the time probably going to be private. And what that does is it creates a context and a shared, I like the term you used, shared reality for everyone working on that specific asset, and everyone is accountable and able to see where the process is at any given time. So our goal was not to say blockchain is going to save the world with everything in it. It is a tool in the tool belt, and it helps add an additional layer of security when and where it's relevant. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you to the other members of the panel, Carol, Cappy, and Craig. In summary, decentralized identification provides a valuable use case for business and enterprise organizations who are seeking to reduce risk and increase the reliability of legacy infrastructures. I think the overall theme of our webinar is that integrating these solutions isn't as hard as you think. They're ready for production. They're being implemented. They're in the market right now. And you're exploring them. Your competitors are exploring them. And it behooves you to get ahead of the curve and really understand what these technologies are going to be able to provide. Now we'll lead on to the Q&A. We have a quite a few questions. So we'll start from the top. And the first question is, how decentralized is this blockchain? Who validates the blocks? What is the motivation for the validators to do so? I believe that was within our first presentation for Carol. Is there any answer there from the panelists?
Hi. Yeah, so hopefully you guys saw the architecture slide that I shared. And I think a couple of the first questions, if it's okay with you, Zach, I'll just power through them because it seems like they're targeted at us. But regarding the blockchain validator, so we're agnostic to the underlying blockchain that our customers choose to anchor to. And so we inherit whatever the governance structure is of the underlying protocol. So today we've most often worked with public Ethereum or private forks, namely Quorum, and then Hyperledger Fabric. And I'm happy to, my email's on my slides, I'm happy to go into kind of what that looks like when, depending on which decentralized identity method we use. We use most popularly the SideTree element decentralized identity method, which is uses basically batches operations such that it's an incredibly scalable and cost-effective decentralized identity method to use. And then I think another one of the questions talked about asked about companies who haven't yet adopted decentralized solutions and want to move in that direction. And I saw another question around how we integrate with legacy infrastructure. And I think some of the other panelists will have answers to that as well. But from a Transmute perspective, we view the three main barriers to adoption. We absolutely think identity and decentralized identity is where customers should start when assessing decentralized opportunities. And you should first take an inventory of your existing infrastructure before, so that you can bring that to the table with you. The three barriers to adoption that we see in this space are, number one, integration with OAuth and OpenID Connect. Basically, once these integrations happen, decentralized identity infrastructure can instantly provide significant security improvements and cost savings for almost all enterprise IAM and security products. And so that is where we integrate today. So we inextricably link the identities that already exist, say, in your Okta instance, to decentralized identity, to decentralized identifiers. And so that's how we handle legacy integrations at Transmute. And we also view that as integrations with OpenID Connect as one of the major barriers to adoption. The other two barriers to adoption my co-panelists have also touched on, which is decentralized identity interoperability. So how can the credentials generated in someone else's system live in Transmute's wallet, and how can we make sure that the purpose of decentralized identity is to have a persistent identifier across heterogeneous systems doesn't break down across vendors in the space. So that would be the second barrier to adoption. And then the final barrier to adoption from our perspective is government support. And this is largely because they drive a lot of the open standards work. And in addition to that, our entire lives as businesses or, as business entities or individuals are based on some foundational credentials that are initially issued or enforced by generally government agencies and authorities.
Great, thank you for that. Anything else from the other panelists in regard to any of those questions? I believe one of the top questions was, how does a traditional enterprise integrate these solutions with their legacy infrastructure? Anybody else have anything?
Yeah, Zach, this is Kapi. I think this was a common theme across all the presenters. Obviously there'll be people starting from a green field where they're building brand new solutions for whichever area they're targeting. But in the enterprise space, 99% of the customers you are dealing with have got legacy. As Carol mentioned, they are complying with government regulations and all kinds of other statutes and process issues, etc. So you need to have this ability to take what they've got and blend it with your blockchain. And so I think all of us believe that the integration with, I see there was a question about Azure Active Directory. we have to integrate with all of those legacy systems. I don't know if legacy is the right word, actually, but it's about creating this coexisting universe where the two come together. People are not going to create a brand new blockchain identity system and abandon the old one, pretty much as I think everybody on this call has been saying. So we have to figure out how to coexist, and it's a very important point. Nobody's going to jump across the chasm without some of their legacy.
So that kind of leads to another question that was for you, Cappy. Is Nextledger a blockchain?
Well, if you think Hyperledger and Ethereum are blockchains, then it is.
What does
we're not like Hedera or anything like that. So it is a blockchain in that context. So we are a hybrid. So there's some chain code aspect to what we do, and there's some Ethereum style technology that we use. So it's both. I believe we actually are a blockchain, but maybe the purists might disagree with me. I don't know.
All right. Someone says Hyperledger. Which project?
Oh, now you're getting into the weeds. I'm not one of the development team, so I can't really get into the weeds of that.
Okay, well, I could answer that. I believe the answer is Fabric, but I may be wrong.
Oh, you mean in that context? Yeah. So it is Fabric. It is Fabric. Yes. Sorry, I was expecting much deeper answer than that.
Yeah. So that question comes from John Wolpert, who's actually a pretty well-known troll and one of the founders of Hyperledger. So.
Absolutely, he was. Hi, John. Good to see you on the network again.
Yeah. And we got another question from Christian that says, essentially, how do panel members define identity? And that relates to another question, which is, what is self-sovereign identity? What does it mean to be self-sovereign? What is identity?
That's a great question. I'll take a quick stab at that. I'm sure everyone has their own answer for what is identity. It's just a way for a person to interact and have a relationship with another person or another organization without having to share, or with only having to share certain specific parts of their personal identifiers. Right. So I think identity is basically knowing how to address someone in an interaction, how to address a device or a person in an interaction with only having to know the minimal amount of information to execute that transaction.
That makes sense. So I'm sorry. Continue.
Yeah, I was just going to add a quick one that's kind of resonated with me. You're going to get 1,000 different answers based on this because it's a mix of objective and subjective, but we usually think about it from the framework of bibliographic, biometric, and behavioral, and that can be for people or things. And generally, it's what that person or thing has done, something that can uniquely identify them and their behaviors, how they operate, so you can create predictability and access controls around it.
Yeah, and also let's not forget that we are talking about identity of more than just people. We're also talking about identity of devices and things. So I totally agree. I think the definition of identity is in the eye of the beholder. And so, as Craig said, you really want your identity to provide the credentials that's essential to the consumer of those credentials. And everyone's going to have a different definition of that. A bank will have a different need for identity, and a supply chain company might have a completely different need for identity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're going to get different definitions of identity depending on the application.
Great. For companies who haven't yet adopted decentralized solutions, but want to begin to move in that direction, what should they be doing internally to prepare for this migration? Is decentralized identity a good place to start?
I can take that. Kind of what I said in my presentation and a little bit at the beginning, identity from our perspective, is the only rational starting place, given that it really has to be addressed in order to start to move your existing processes and systems towards more decentralized models. And it's also the thing that solving for will enable the fully decentralized business models. And so I think from our perspective, given the technology is really nascent, and you can hear all of us referencing blockchain as just one tool in the toolbox, we push customers really, really hard to focus first on where are the pains within the business? So where are you losing revenue? Where do you need to cut costs? And then what is your existing infrastructure stack? The one thing you don't want to do that we see a lot of folks in the early days implementing SSIs and decentralized identities doing is not looking at the underlying existing workflow or process. And you want to solve, there are a lot of people management and just operational inefficiencies that need to be solved for first, so that you don't just codify an inefficient process by layering on technologies like this. And so we spend a lot of time with companies talking through that and where decentralized identities or the kinds of traceability that our product specifically enables are most useful.
Great. We have a question from Reagan Hackett, and I think one of the questions is how would Samsung mobile devices provide value over other devices when paired with a military-grade blockchain identity and security solution?
So I guess that one's for me, Zach, and I'll take it. Actually, we've been involved in a couple of projects that unfortunately under NDA we probably can't talk about, but I'd love to have an offline discussion on that topic, Reagan, if you want to talk about it.
Great. And the other question is, do these products have an API or some kind of gateway to allow for integration with public cloud like Azure? Another question is are these compatible with Azure's Active Directory?
On our end, the answer is absolutely yes. Transmute ID you can think of as a souped up API, and we use standard APIs throughout our product to support those integrations.
Ditto for us.
Yeah, in summary, I mean, you have to be able to address any legacy directory system, and Azure is one of the big ones out there, so you have to be able to do that.
All right. For a question for Syniverse, could you explain how payments work on the blockchain network when exchanging verifiable credentials?
I can answer that briefly at a high level. I would say it's probably two parts. The verifiable credentials establish the identity of the parties involved in value transfer. We tend to call it value transfer because I think, as Kapi alluded to it, it can be loyalty points, game credits, fiat currency, cryptocurrency. So the verifiable credentials come in establishing the relationship, the trust between the two parties, as well as essentially, are they good for it, right? Is there credit on the account? Is a person good for paying the amount of money for the transaction? And I would say the second part of that would come back to the universal commerce settling, smart contracts and transactions that are executed on the blockchain. I'm not sure if that's what the question was referring, but at a high level, the verifiable credentials would establish the trust in the parties and the ability to execute the transaction.
All right. Our next question is, what are the challenges for decentralized identity adoption in Fortune 500 enterprises?
I can take a quick stab at this one. Generally, the thing that we've experienced from our side is that no one really buys identity as the first order priority. Most of the times identity is reactive instead of proactive. And also it's the secondary functions that identity provides that people usually are buying. So that's either access control, governance, things like that, permissioning. So it's tough to sell to an enterprise if they're not proactively thinking about the security and access controls of their systems or the parties or entities interfacing with them. At least that's what we found so far.
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. So I think the other one is regulation, and the fact that, regulation falls into two buckets in my book. One, which is regulation that hinders, and one is regulation that actually frees you to actually operate, because it creates a consistent platform on which people can build. And I think regulation is one of the big inhibitors, because a lot of people have built legacy identity based on regulation, and they don't know the path to the future.
Good point.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those things, but we also, or both of your comments, and push you guys not to necessarily think of identity first, but where trust enforcement is required. And when you think about, especially in supply chain logistics, I think there's a question around cold chains or drug supply chains is a really good example where in the medical sphere, you think of all medical supply chains as requiring a lot of traceability, but actually class 1 and class 2 medical devices have different traceability regulations enforced on them than, say, pharmaceuticals, which are much higher margins and have a lot of new regulations driving change in that space. So while I agree that sometimes regulations can be inhibiting, we have been looking for spaces where there is increasing regulatory pressure to be able to identify products and people at a much more granular level. And we think that is, or at least in our customer base, we're seeing that drive significant adoption. And I think then subsequently focusing on whether or not you're actually looking for traceability or predictability, which I think Jacob referenced before. And I would say the technology today and all the solutions we've described are ready to be deployed to support traceability and compliance applications. But predictability with systems like this is something that would need to be built over time. And candidly, a lot of competing systems would cannibalize margins at some of these basically cheaper products that don't necessarily require as much traceability, but might desire more predictability.
We have another question about Samsung SDS, but how does Samsung SDS address reputation? What's the solution? But I think more broadly is how do any of these systems account for reputation, and what is the relationship between reputation and identity within these systems?
So since it was addressed as Samsung, I mean, reputation is basically what we call credentials. And the reputation you get based on credentials is what we really would like people to store connected to an ID. So reputation and ID are connected but separate. And the credentials that you need, let's say if you're applying for a job versus the credentials you need to transact with the bank are quite different. So there is no standard in my book anyway, standard definition of reputation, because reputation has context. And you basically have to separate the two and figure out what's needed in terms of reputation. But the identity is something that I think is fundamental to all of this, pretty much as Carol has said and others said on this call. But reputation is something completely different. And I noticed somebody here talked about self-sovereign identity and control by the owner. I think that's right. But at the end of the day, you will give up your credentials based on need. If you go to a phone company and say, I'm not going to share any of my credentials, but they may say, no, I'm not going to sell you a phone.
Cappy, I think you're breaking up a bit.
I'm not sure why, but okay. I don't know how much of that you caught. Somebody else answer.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question? Any answer to the relationship between reputation and identity?
Well, you certainly want to associate the two. There's reputation associated with behavior, right, of a device. Yeah. Fraud reporting and things like that. So that also could be, converted into a form of credential saying, again, this party or this device can be trusted based on its behavior. So reputation is, kind of historical, right? Historical, and if there's been any fraud reports associated with the device, that's how it would be tied to a specific identity or verifiable credential.
All right. So we're running out of time here, so let's take one more question, and this comes from Reagan Hackett again. What is everyone's thoughts on small and medium businesses and local banks adopting decentralized identity solutions? What are some of the top blockchain development companies that could work with local system integrators and IT management service providers to bring solutions to market? Would ConsenSys be a possible partner for local SI, ISV, and MPSs to bring blockchain solutions to the market for small and medium business in the US? It's kind of wordy.
The short answer is yes. If you want to reach out, I can connect you to the correct people. We have a number of people that interface with enterprises,
All right,
or even these smaller banks.
Yeah, and also same with us. I mean, we are getting more interest from like credit union type, organizations than local banks. Definitely is an area we are interested in.
All right. So it's 11:13 and we've run over. So I think that we'll wrap it up here. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
We will we'll send out a recording of this webinar to everybody that's subscribed. If you have any more questions or concerns, feel free to shoot us an email. My email is Zach, that's zak@whiteblock.io. I'll allow for any closing comments from our panelists if they want, and then otherwise we'll wrap it up. Any closing comments, fellas?
Just thank you to you, Zach and Aaron, and for the opportunity, and thanks for all the attendees. It was a really interesting, exciting session.
Yeah, same here.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much.
And feel free to reach out.
Absolutely.
Thank you.